So, one of the biggest predicaments I see in the world of employer branding when I see employer branders talking on places like LinkedIn, for example, is the challenge of feeling like you're the only person doing your job or feeling there's quite a small boat. But actually, there are a lot of people out there working in the world of employer branding, and it's always great to hear what other people's experiences are and also look about the positioning of employer branding and the reputation of employer branding within organizations. So I'm absolutely delighted to have Neil and Mike back on the podcast to talk about a report that they did, a newer version of the one they did about, I think, when was it, guys? 2.5 years that we last spoke about the previous report. Well, a whole lot has happened since then, isn't it? We've had coming out the back of COVID, we've had cost of living crisis, we've had well, Ukraine, we've had all sorts and we've obviously got election as well. So it's great. It's great you guys can take the time out to do something so in depth in this kind of report. So yeah, it's certainly very valuable to people, and reading through it is some great insight. So I'll stop gassing on now. Just have a bit of an introduction about yourselves, and then we'll dive into kind of the key findings of the report. Who wants to go first?
Okay, I'll tee off. Yeah, it's good to be back again, 2.5 years on. I think the other important thing is that we're still here and we're still doing what we do, which is good. Yeah, exactly, huzzah. My name's Mike Jeffries. I'm Client Services Director and joint owner of an agency called WDAD Communications. We've been around for many, many years, and we're an employer brand and talent attraction agency. And we're involved because we partner with Neil on the delivery of projects that might encompass both the EVP and discovery and definition element, which Neil specializes in, and then we will often get involved in the delivery of the employer brand material, the assets related to talent attraction. And we've worked successfully for a little while now.
Indeed. Yeah, so my name's Neil Harrison. I operate an independent consultancy in the EVP and EB space, NH237. I've been doing that, gosh, 7-ish or so years, having spent a number of years prior to that in employer branding agencies. So I work both independently and with guys like Mike and Mike at WDAD, and I think that partnership has stood the test of time, and we both enjoyed a lot of that out of it. Um, yeah.
Nice. And why? So the report, we've got the employer branding and EVP landscape today. Just just interested to know about kind of why you do this report. I mean, I like to ask simple questions, but it's always nice to kind of the why behind doing such a body of work.
I, I, I think it's a really important question. I mean, we're doing the second iteration of this, largely the way you teed that up, I think, speaks volumes of this. The industry, the world, has been through such a lot of change over the last 2.5, 3 years. Any time you want to say post COVID, it's been a roller coaster ride in terms of the economy, in terms of how that's affected the different labour markets. And an EVP is not a vacuum. It responds and it reacts to how the labour market and how the economy is functioning. And we've seen such a kind of variety of different environments over the course of the last 2.5 years that we wanted, I suppose, to understand how things had moved on, how things had changed, if indeed they had. And no massive surprise to see that there's been lots of kind of change. And I think it's important, as you kind of teed up, there's a sense that individuals can be plowing their own kind of furrow and not having that sense of validation, that sense of actually how are other people doing that. And I think this is just one of many tools to enable that, to give people that sense of reassurance that some of the pressures, some of the challenges, some of the positives indeed that they're experiencing, they're not doing it on their own, and it's mirrored across the industry.
When you go to conferences, often it's just like it's the glitz and the glamour of this is how successful a campaign was, and it's I've kind of heard time and time again it's about, well, actually we want to hear the challenges as well. let's, and I think that's actually some of the most valuable conversations that happens at events is the stuff in between the stages. Obviously, the stuff on stage is good as well, but it's those other bits in between. So I think, yeah, reports like this are great to make people feel, oh, I wondered why I was having that challenge, or yeah, absolutely, that's me as well. And I think that in itself is like, it's great, isn't it? It's fantastic. So let's let's chat about key findings then. So actually, before that, I suppose, how many people did you go out to?
So this is a study based on survey completion. So it's a quantitative piece of research. We got the completed survey details from just under 100 people across the sort of senior TA marketplace in the UK. So it's reasonably robust. It's not a YouGov thing that's going to predict the election right now, but it's pretty indicative of, for me, the kind of sentiments, the feelings moving forward across our industry. So yeah, so we were indebted to just under 100 people who took the time to fill in the survey. As you suggested, there's four people who also just kind of gilded the lily a little bit and gave us their kind of more qualitative thoughts around some of the details there. So the guys we've got listed there, I think, were hugely useful, just giving a sense of context about the results there, and really appreciative of that.
We're quite lucky that because we've been around quite a long time between us, we've got a lot of very good contacts in that area. Even if they're not working with us now, we've got a really good pool of people that we can reach out to. Neil in particular. So yeah, it's great to get that many people responding.
I think you're absolutely right, Mike. And I think sometimes organisations underutilise their contacts and they kind of see it as being, understandably, I suppose, kind of sales funnels and the chance to get business. But actually, the biggest value is the conversations you can have. That's really the greatest thing. And that's something that the people will likely read in this don't have, that reach into all those people, and maybe only get it if they go to the odd conference every now and then. Maybe not be able to go to so many conferences because the big ones are so expensive. But yeah, I think it's fantastic, and you got a solid number there, and it's good to see like Stu Hayes and Claire D'Souza in there, as we've had good chats with them. And yeah, so what are the kind of key findings from this report then?
There's an awful lot of stuff, and I'll go through some of the kind of highlights. Mike, kind of interrupt, cut in, disagree as you see fit. Um, I think probably the one that stood out probably as much as anything was around diversity, ED&I. And this is one of those areas where we were able to compare the response from 2.5 years ago with this year. So we asked a question about if you were to focus spending in terms of your EB, what would be the areas in which you focus that spending particularly? And 2.5 years ago, over half our respondents saw ED&I spending as being a real area of focus. We asked exactly the same question earlier on this year, and that number had declined by half. So we had something like 27-28% of people now saw ED&I as an area where they were going to focus that spending. And at kind of first cut, there's a slight sense of, is that a negative reading? How do we interpret that? And I've sort of persuaded myself actually it's a positive reading, because no longer now is ED&I something which you have to bolt on, something as an extra. It's kind of business as usual. So it's the mainstream of EB spending. So it's not something you have to justify to the extent you perhaps would have 2.5, 3 years ago, and it's a core element of EB investment.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Anything to add, Mike?
Well, there's a couple of things that perhaps resonate from our side on the employer brand aspect and also who we talk to. So I thought it was very interesting that there is, with EVP having more of an internal presence and influence, or the drive to have a more internal presence and influence, the overlap now between our traditional TA professional contacts and internal comms as well. So, there's obviously a big overlap there now, and so it's important for us in that respect that we need to think, are we, making sure we're talking to the right people. So increasingly, internal comms are involved in delivering on these EVP and then employer brand projects. So that was one interesting point for me and for us. And another one was that the I can never say that word. The difference between your employer brand and somebody else's is a challenge for a lot of in-house professionals, and people are struggling to stand out. And the thought for me there is that with the increasing temptation to use AI to produce some of that material, that could get worse. So whilst AI can deliver some great benefits, it's a point to note. I think if you want to stand out, consider carefully how you use AI. Don't just use it to produce all your material.
It's very true. It's like anything, technology changes and evolves, but the same thing applies as you get you get out what you put in. And so really, I think there is that massive danger of like this content dump on the internet becoming like, well, 10 times, 100 times larger, just because it's easier to create content. I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. Like my view is that AI just there's too much in employer branding. There's too much talk about AI in terms of like writing copy, writing job descriptions, where actually AI can play another role in terms of data and also in terms of, post production as well. There's a whole load of things there. But anyway, that's actually
That's
something
a
we're going to
whole
be covering off
nother
in an
subject, isn't it?
episode later
Yeah.
on. Absolutely, absolutely. Well,
You touched on data, and I think that's one of the key outtakes from this whole kind of
okay,
exercise. In that, slightly frustratingly, I don't think anyone in the profession does a good enough job in terms of measurability and metrics. And if you cast your mind back, goodness knows how many years to when employer branding effectively was first kind of shaped and outlined, it was off the back of comparisons with consumer branding.
Simon Barrow. Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
indeed, Mr. Barrow, Mr.
Mhm.
Mosley, and that's really, really important because those spaces there, so consumer branding, consumer marketing, are very scientific in their use of data and metrics. One of the, I guess, the kind of challenges that really shaped itself there and became very clear was that employer branding can really struggle in terms of making its own case. So we asked a question about the metrics that people use to demonstrate the effectiveness or otherwise of their EVP and employer branding initiatives, and also how that plays with senior leadership within their organization. So typically, there's a big disparity between the metrics that a lot of professionals within this kind of space generate and what they think will play well to that senior
Mm,
audience.
mm,
And that's clearly the audience that's going to be making decisions about further investment with employer branding. Now, the economy is going in the right direction, but it's been a very challenging last 18 months. And we've had, there have been redundancies clearly across EVP and employer branding. So the need and the challenge to create a really solid and robust business case around what people are doing in the EVP space, the employer branding space, has arguably never been as important. And I don't think an awful lot of organisations get it right in terms of creating the sort of metrics that the people at the top of their organization who are making those decisions are going to be influenced
mm.
by. I think as well, it applies as well to benchmarking, and that's where the point Mike was making
He could
around
say it.
differentiation comes out
Well
there.
said. You
So
can
we
say the
asked
word.
people,
Well done.
sorry.
Yeah, that's it.
I
Oh, that actually,
got,
there was a YouTuber
I'm
is
not going
like
to say it again.
he's got thousands of followers and et cetera, et cetera. And he did exactly the same thing yesterday. Differentiation. It's like said it multiple times. So well done, guys. Yeah, there's that.
I'm not going to say it again. So I think the ability to benchmark varies massively. So we ask people, about their benchmarking activities, the work they're doing, how does it compare to industry rivals, so the sort of competition for talent that they're up against. And it's sort of a game of two halves. An awful lot of people, so just under 60% of people felt that their work, what they were doing, their initiatives, benchmarked really positively with the competition. And then we had the have-nots, if you like, and something like 18% of people said we don't benchmark at all, and another 18-19% felt that actually they didn't, as a result of benchmarking, they hadn't got a clue how they configured with the competition there. So you've got arguably half the group there who are potentially a bit buoyant, a bit giddy about how they're benchmarking, and another group of people who frankly aren't doing any benchmarking at all, or for whom their benchmarking is simply ineffective. So how can you really differentiate yourself, got away with it again, from the marketplace if you don't know what the marketplace is doing? And that for me is again really quite telling. And that's arguably, it's kind of potentially a space where AI could help in terms of creating really kind of understanding about what the marketplace, what your competitor set is doing and saying across employer branding and messaging. And if you kind of don't know what that competitor set is doing, how do you create clear blue water from the work you're preparing and presenting for marketplace there? And again, this work does not happen in a vacuum. People, the candidate audience, will be looking at a whole bunch of different messaging, and if it all looks pretty similar, then what's their decision making process? And all of a sudden, they're probably looking at hygiene factors like purely about money, purely about location, if those messages look a bit homogenous.
Yeah. Oh my God. There's so much to unpack there. We haven't got time to unpack it all. But there is a massive there's a
Yeah,
reason why it
yeah.
was that
I mean,
Chris Murdoch
absolutely.
created Employer Bland podcast, the Employer Bland podcast, because it's
Hmm.
so true. I think there's too much vanilla out there, really. I mean, the
I think there's too much vanilla, and I think it's kind of what Mike was saying around there is a real move, and this came through really loud and clear during this kind of survey, that most practitioners see their work as getting closer and closer to other internal communications. Now, whether that's internal communications, whether that's consumer branding, consumer marketing, they see their work as sharing more and more DNA with those sources, and actually even to the point of potentially sharing teams and resources with the internal comms people. There's lots and lots of positives around that, because one of the kind of typical issues that people had and challenges was around resources, was around manpower, and simply not having the size of team to be able to deliver what was asked of them. So actually sharing the resources with the likes of internal comms has its benefits. Where it has its challenges, if you've got more and more decision makers there having a call on what your output is going to look like, if you're not careful, that's where it becomes a bit vanilla. That's where you become a committee trying to design a horse and coming up with a camel, and that's a challenge around that. I can see, and I see lots of positives around greater continuity, greater sense of sharing that DNA with other kind of internal resources, internal processes, and communications. There's a tendency there, if you've got more and more people making decisions around what it looks and feels like, that you end up with something that doesn't offend anybody and potentially doesn't really appeal to very many people either.
yeah, I've seen like Sharu's shared, I think, a few cartoons. One of them, on LinkedIn. One of them being, I think, a bunch of chefs around a hob, which is, oh, this soup is a
Yeah,
bit
yeah,
bland because it's water. It's
mm,
but
yeah.
yeah, it's a tough one, isn't it? Because I think you're absolutely right. The kind of the combination of internal comms and employer branding is, I think, for me, such a nice fit. but trying to bring two areas of business that should have really the ultimate goal, but maybe have different objectives. It can be difficult to bridge the two. But yeah, perhaps that's a conversation I could have actually with later on. It's a big one.
Yeah, I mean, on the surface of it, it makes a bunch of sense because if you're taking people from candidates through to interviewees and applicants into becoming employees, they kind of logically need to listen to a similar message because the reason they joined should be the reason they stay or have a certain similarity with that. And if all of a sudden they're listening to completely different messages, then it's kind of not it's not a big surprise if they start questioning why they joined in the first place. But yes, it absolutely makes sense. But making it work is potentially a different matter.
I mean, that goes back to the thing about how it's positioned with leadership as well. I think there's a perfect opportunity to actually, to actually position it as being something where it's more strategically aligned, and also there's a cost saving. Well, there's not cost saving necessarily, but a double benefit there. I think, yes, obviously from a talent attraction perspective, but also from an internal engagement perspective, but also from, and this creeps into another area of business, is a B2B or B2B perspective, because there's absolute value in a customer or a client, actually, or an investor seeing employees at an organization sharing their expertise, not just sharing their stories about there is a place for it, not just sharing their stories about how they get flexible working and all that, or you know the journey they've had in an organization, but their actual expertise and the advice they can give people that could be their future colleagues. Someone sees that from a B2B or B2C perspective, or even from an investor perspective, and go, I'm really starting to get an idea about the swagger of this organization, the vibe of this organization. And that, for me, employed branding is a mirror rather than a painting. I think often it's treated too much as a painting in a gallery. Again, there's a place for it, but I think there's too much reliance on that.
Well, that
Um,
was another aspect that came out from this survey is that one of the areas of concern uh, is is being able to generate enough employee stories at pace
yes,
um,
yes.
to showcase properly what that organisation is about.
Mm,
So there is poor execution across many platforms of that employee content, whether it's homemade videos, oh, we can do this ourselves, and yes, you can, but you're going to look like everybody else who's done it themselves. And
mm.
that was one of the points that came out from this, that the telling the stories properly remains a challenge.
Yeah, especially when teams and budgets are tight as well. That's going to be difficult.
I think there's an important phrase in what Mike's just said is around at pace, and I think that was another kind of really interesting insight that came through, and I think very positively, people are approaching constructing an EVP and subsequent employer branding work that comes out of that in a much more professional manner. They're also being more representative, so they're engaging with lots more internal employees to understand, whether it's about creating stories, whether it's about listening to them and letting them shape the EVP. That's absolutely fantastic. One of the downsides is that process can become extremely long, and that's another challenge because we talked about at the start of this presentation was how things change at real pace. We've had a pandemic, we've had lockdown, we've had a really buoyant market, we've had a really stretched marketplace. Potentially things are starting to improve right now. If you're doing that discovery work, that kind of research work into how an employee base is feeling, where their organization is going, those kind of cultural pulse takings, if that process is now taking, as it can do, months and months and months, and up to a year, then you're relying on a message which is based on research which can be 9 months, 12 months old, and actually things moved on. The labour market's moved on. The employee base in lots of cases will have moved on. Certainly, kind of the culture will have changed as well. So you really risk bringing to market a set of employer branding messages which belong to a year ago, rather than actually what's relevant now in terms of where the hearts and minds of what people are feeling and where the organisation is going. So it's great that people are taking this, are being much more considered, much more professional about this. It does mean that there needs to be more sense of nimbleness about how we go about it.
I think, understandably, given everything that's gone on, there is an element of paralysis in the market. There's always a good reason just to hold off and not do something at the moment. And now, of course, it's the election is the latest reason on the horizon. And again, from another interesting point from the research was that the less than half of the people we spoke to feel that should the labour market become more competitive, they're ready. So they know they're not quite there, they're not quite ready, and they can see this potential problem on the horizon. But who now needs convincing that this is a good time to address the issue? I think that's the challenge. Well, it's a challenge for us and also for those EVP professionals.
And if you look at where GDP is going, if you look at all the kind of relevant surveys around PMS, economy is going in the right direction. And Mike's right. If you're paralyzed by caution and wariness, and the process by which you shift your positioning and your messaging is taking multiple months, if not years, you've kind of missed the boat. And other more nimble, more agile organizations are going to be out there with a much more positive message, which is indicative of today rather than where we were 6, 9 months ago.
I've seen a large organization, global organization, someone on LinkedIn celebrating that they've launched their new EVP and their employer branding program after 12 months. And it's like I can just kind of sense the relief in their words that they've done it, which is kind of
Yeah.
maybe papers over. Maybe the slight crack is that, oh my God, it took 12 months. It's yeah. Although it is difficult because you need to go through kind of due diligence, etc., and make sure you got something robust. But I'm more of a fan of something that is a bit more. Well, let's go to strategy. Strategy is something that just always evolves. Always evolve. Dave Angus, who I've had on the podcast, he's a chief strategy officer at a content agency, and he says like strategy never sleeps, but it's true. It's absolutely true. It's always evolving, which means you've got to evolve with the times, and you can't
But I mean,
lean on a massively long program to react to things. Yeah.
But that's so indicative, I think, of where EVP has been and is moving away from that sense of it's something you do every 3 or 4 years. Fantastic, we've achieved it. Thank goodness for that. Let's put it in a little box and forget about it until the next kind of 3, 4 year cycle begins, rather than something that's a lot more organic and is able to deal with a changing economic or labour market climate. And if you've got something that's now 4 years old, everything has changed. So, I mean, that's a real concern. I mean, for me, one of the kind of most telling things after all this, and actually generally, the kind of vibe and the sentiment we got from people was pretty positive. That there were obviously some question marks and some kind of challenges. One of the most telling kind of stats that emerged from this was just 7% of our survey felt that their EVP was where they wanted it to be right now. And actually, you can say, well, actually, that's quite positive because people are analyzing and scanning and they're quite self-aware. The fact is that 93% therefore, as a result of that, probably don't feel their EVP is where they want to be right now. there's a lot that can be done to improve, to enhance that, and again, as we've talked about before, it needs to be done with a certain degree of agility, whilst being done comprehensively and representing all an organisation's different internal stakeholder groups. But yeah, I thought that was really, really telling.
Well, since we have kind of final kind of key theme that's come from it, because we'll make sure obviously people can access the full report somewhere near this episode for sure. But yeah, what's the kind of other kind of final key theme that might be touching on some of the stuff we said already? But yeah, what's your final theme?
Yeah, I think it's rather summing up what we've talked about there. I think organizations need, or rather, TA professionals need to understand what are the key internal metrics which will shape opinions. So if I'm going to the FD, the C suite in general, to say, this is what we've done last year, and this is what I want to do next year, and therefore this is the budget I'm asking for. How do you justify that? What's the ROI? And I know Ben Phillips is doing a lot of kind of work around LinkedIn around this, and that's a key criteria. You have to be speaking the language that's understood within the boardroom if you're to, particularly when we've had a really quite challenging last 18 months. So people will be looking at bottom line, people will be contemplating cost cutting. Your ability to talk in an appropriate language and use appropriate metrics is going to make a massive difference in securing, well, frankly, the team, but certainly securing the budget going forward there. So for me, I think that's really, really important. Um, so whether it's making that internal case, I think extending this thing about metrics, understanding what the marketplace is doing, understanding what your competitive set are doing. For me, that's easier. Whether you're making use of your agency partners, whether you're making internal resources there, whether you're making use of AI, I think that's relatively straightforward. But nearly half the people we spoke to, frankly, don't do it or don't do it very effectively. Um, and I think the other, just to sum up, whatever you're doing, do it at pace, do it with kind of speed, because that's the marketplace in which you're living. Things are changing on a very things are changing all the time, and I think whether it's that whole kind of research and discovery process, whether that's telling the stories your people are generating, and people internally usually want to tell a story about how they've grown, how they've developed, how this organization continues to be the right choice for them. um, it's about doing that at pace and with agility, and not taking too long. So the story you're telling are the stories of today rather than the stories of maybe 12 months ago.
Yeah, I,
Yeah, lovely.
I think the market's battered and bruised. Understandably, we've already touched on everything that the market's been through over the last few months, but we've been around long enough to know that it won't be too long before there will be a need for people to get people on board quickly. And the one
Mm,
thing that we've talked about here is that at the moment it feels like people look at these projects with that they have a start and they have an end, and they have a period of reflection, and then maybe they go around again. And that's not the way
mm,
to do it. It should be a constant process with touch points throughout the the financial year, which then informs the next stage of your process. It doesn't finish; it's continuous. And
mm.
too many of the conversations we have are, well, we've done that for now. We'll have 6 months not thinking about it, and you're going to get caught out.
Create a yeah. I think yeah. There's that thing about creating projects that are too big, and actually, one of the reasons there are gaps in between those big projects is just to have a blooming rest, to take a break from it, and like save up, muster up the information and the courage to then ask for budget later on, because it might take a couple of years to get the budget again. So maybe the industry needs to give itself a bit of a break by making those projects smaller, more consistent, and more agile by doing less but more often.
I think yeah, and I think you're right. I think it's often down to who's delivering it internally, because it's a little bit like the graduate recruitment cycle, and again, that's often 3 or 4 years. And if you're doing the same with the EVP, I suspect that key internal contact will move on because they feel they've done that. Now, whether they're moving to a different organization, whether they're moving up in the world internally. So I think that there's an unspoken feeling that the new person coming in managing that project around EVP, or in some cases graduate recruitment, kind of feels the need to reinvent things because it's that they're putting their stamp on it, quite understandably. Whereas actually it's about it's iterative rather than something we just reinvent every 3 or 4 years. And I think it's an ongoing validation process where you're making sure. I mean, a lot of the great consumer brands we speak about, whether it's Coca-Cola, whether it's HP Sauce, actually they do really small changes to their look and feel, and actually to the naked eye don't look like much change at all. But actually, if you look over a kind of 40-year period, it's changed quite significantly. But you don't notice; it's just been continually updated and tweaked and enhanced.
Continuous process. So if you're
Mm.
if you want to go a long distance, you run at a steady pace and you keep that steady pace. You don't sprint and then
100%.
walk for a bit to recover and then sprint again. That's not the way you do it. And I know it may be a bit of an obvious analogy, but it seems applicable in this particular case.
Absolutely. I mean, Guy, I don't know from doing a load of marathons, less so recently, but um, I'm due to do one actually. But yeah, absolutely. The marathon, not a sprint, is absolutely bang on for this. It like really is, and I think it's just about knowing when to sprint. When at the right time, but knowing that bit by bit you are making progress. And I think this is maybe the challenge. This is why it's great to have reports like this. This is one of the challenges when going back to the thing about going to conferences, where it's like a big showpiece, ta-da, this is the massive program that happened. It's like it can seem a bit daunting. So you think about the 26.2 miles and not that it's just a few 6 mile
Yeah.
runs with a bit
We're
on
the
the end.
Garmin watch.
So
Whilst you're doing the running, we're the Garmin watch where you can check your stats and make sure you're going in the right direction.
exactly. Well, cheers, gents. Look, really, that's really useful. So what we'll do is we'll, make sure that the report's available near this episode in the episode description. And yeah, really enjoyed it. Thanks very much.